So we left off last week. This is class 4 of 5 for Buddhism in a nutshell. And we began last week looking at Lama Tsongkhapa's lamrim prayer, or glance meditation on the lamrim. And we covered the first 2 verses. And so those were the importance of our relationship with the spiritual guide or the guru, and then also the 18 qualities of a perfect human rebirth. And we said that the first contemplation, the preciousness of the guru, is applicable to all of the scopes of the lamrim, the small scope, the middle scope, and the great scope. So in that sense, it's in a way not part of any of the scopes because it applies equally, whereas in general, the scopes, each scope has a unique purpose or role to play. The role that the low scope plays is to create the causes and the conditions for a practitioner to care more about what happens after death than they do about the content of this life alone. So to be focused on the overall spiritual trajectory that one is on, rather than just accumulating pleasure and comfort that it can only extend for the remainder of this one life. And, could be that a person only practices the small scope, but that's not really even a full goal, even of Theravadan practice, because the Theravadan practice, their stated goal is lower nirvana or individual enlightenment, and which doesn't occur on the small scope, that occurs on the middle scope for Theravadan practitioner. And then for a Mahayana practitioner, like Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, which is what our center is, that's the lineage of our center, they would progress even to the great scope. But that initial relationship with the spiritual guide is equally applicable regardless of whether one's motivation is good future rebirths or it is to become fully disenchanted with cyclic existence as a whole, which is the middle scope, or it's to seek full enlightenment, which is the great scope. At any scope, the relationship with the teacher is critically relevant. And of course, too, it's also true that we don't abandon the teachings, the other teachings on the small scope, that we're looking at. We maintain an awareness of the importance of the fact that we have a perfect human rebirth, and we maintain an awareness of these other realizations that we will look at. But we add to them. They don't serve the purpose of the small scope. When a person progresses to the middle scope or the great scope, the realizations of the previous scopes, they've moved beyond that motivation, but still the individual realizations, the individual topics still maintain a salience for those practitioners. So now we'll go on to verse 3. Verse 3, so we just got done talking about how extraordinary our life is, these 18 qualities of a perfect human rebirth. And now verse 3 is on death and impermanence. So now we're confronting the reality that this extraordinary opportunity, this thing of incredible value, isn't something that will last forever in its particular specific incarnation. We may be able, as we saw, we may be able to create the causes and the conditions for more perfect human rebirths, but this specific perfect human rebirth is going to come to an end. And that is something that we have to confront. And that's what the goal of this topic is, verse 3. So the stanza of verse 3 is here. It is, this life is as impermanent as a water bubble. Remember how quickly it decays and death comes. Just like a shadow follows the body, the result of black and white karma follow. So there's different concepts that are brought in here. Really, there's three different main concepts that are touched on here. You have impermanence, you have death, and then you have karma. These are really three distinct concepts or ideas that are all contained in the third verse. So if we look at the first of those three concepts, impermanence, impermanence is distinct from death. The topic, you could say the topic is death and impermanence, but they are different concepts. Impermanence only implies, from a Buddhist perspective, the word impermanence only implies that which changes moment by moment, which we defined when we looked at the four seals. Impermanence was brought up in the context of the four seals, and we defined it as that which changes moment by moment. So we addressed this in that discussion, where we said that, for example, the mind is a phenomenon that is impermanent in the sense that it does change moment by moment by moment, but it doesn't end. It is eternal. So some things are impermanent and yet eternal, and some things are impermanent and temporary. Our physical form is impermanent and temporary. So really, in that sense, death is a consequence of the body's impermanence, because the body is changing moment by moment by moment, and it, due to that, at some point will cease to function well enough to host consciousness. And when the body can no longer serve as a host for consciousness, body and mind will separate, and we call that death, at the moment when body and mind are no longer associated. And that can happen either because the body just wears out, or the fact that the body is impermanent is also what permits, the arising of disease through viruses or bacteria. And it also permits injury, like car accidents, plane crashes, etc. If the body wasn't impermanent, if the body was permanent, then you could experience a plane crash and you would be fine, because the body is permanent and cannot be impacted by the environment. You could be in the presence of viral, particles, and you wouldn't be able to get sick because you weren't sick previously, because the body is permanent. So you could be in the presence of that environmental stimulus and you would be unable to get sick. But the body is impermanent. It is changing moment by moment, and that permits all kinds of unfortunate, consequences. So it could be aging, could be some disease, could be some injury, and all of those are operative because the body is in the nature of impermanence and changing moment by moment by moment. So for us, impermanence in that sense, or death rather, in that sense, is a side effect or a consequence of the body's impermanence. The mind is also changing moment by moment by moment, but that doesn't have any bearing on the fact that this body and this mind at some point will separate. That's really the impermanence of the body. If the body could host consciousness indefinitely forever, then body and mind could remain associated. There isn't any phenomenon in the mind that would require the separation of this body and this mind. It's the impermanence of the body that will require that separation, and we simply call that separation death. Okay, so then we have karma, that follows. Just like a shadow follows the body, the results of black and white karma follow. So here, black and white is sort of a poetic way of referencing positive and negative, or constructive and destructive karmas. And I think we've over the previous classes, addressed, at least in some way, this framework that we have from the Buddha of constructive and destructive, or positive and negative, which are flowing from the Buddha's direct observation of what kind of energy leads to what kind of result. When an action that's motivated by the wish to be of benefit, the wish to help, the wish to, be supportive and, um, encouraging of other people and other sentient beings in general, their lives, their needs, and so on. That's constructive, that's beneficial, that's useful. And that kind of beneficial energy brings a similar kind of beneficial result. When an action is engaged in that's motivated by the wish to cause harm to oneself or other sentient beings, that will also bring a result that is harmful. And so the Buddha simply observed that energy flows in this kind of way over lifetimes, and he observed that some actions are very difficult to be motivated by something beneficial. They are often, or almost always, motivated by something negative, some wish to not be interested in the needs of others, to disregard other people's lives or needs in favor of one's own preferences. So you could say that when we act in really, really tight, selfish ways at the expense of others, then that's a negative motivation, a negative energy. When we act in ways that take the needs of others into account, and we act in pro-social, beneficial ways, then that's positive. And those energies have different characteristics, different, flavors to them. And when that karmic seed that's laid down ripens, there will be a correlation between that kind of energy and the result that it brings. And so we call that, and that again is just simply the Buddha's own personal observation of the movement of energy in this way. And here, again, black and white is just a poetic reference to that system. Okay, so let me pause here. That's a good bit of information in verse 3. Any thoughts or questions or anything from last week? I didn't start by asking if there were questions from last week. We could address those as well. And
Um,
Joe, if you have
oh,
anything as well. Yeah. another participant as well. So welcome, Joe. If you have any questions, please let me know. Yes, Susan.
Venerable, so karma has a particular kind of energy, and does that energy gravitate to, does it, like if it's positive energy, does it meet with positive, accumulate, that's the word, does it accumulate positive energy or negative? In other words, do they have their own sort of momentum, each one?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that what we focus on, what we practice, it will, and we'll look at that's the next major section, because you can see here from verse 4 is sort of the consequence of verse 3. So we're going to go into a lengthy section on karma, but one of the one of the tendencies of karma is that we are kind of attracted to engaging in what we've practiced, what we've done before. It's kind of you can kind of think of it like a groove that we wear into the mind by, by practice. Or you could just call it a habit or a tendency, or, like you're saying, and it's sort of like an inertia that we develop. If a person spends their life making a strong effort to intentionally engage in virtue, then for one, in that life, but then also Buddhism would assert in future lives, they will more easily fall into that groove. It will be more so like second nature. They've developed that tendency, that habit. And the opposite is also true. If a person spends, the majority of their life kind of cultivating non-virtue, stealing from others, being deceptive, etc., then in this life and also in future lives, there will be a momentum, like you're saying, an inertia from that intentional cultivation. And they will have a difficult time moving out of that. Now, it's not fatalistic in any way, of course. We have inherited, we've come into this life with karmic predispositions. We've inherited certain tendencies and so on from previous lives, some of which are beneficial, some of which are probably not beneficial. But and so it may require more effort, more intentionality to put an end to certain cycles of tendencies or habits. But it's not like it's inevitable or fatalistic. It's just that when we practice something, we find that it comes more easily to the mind. And so we have certain imprints that are virtuous that we've practiced before, and we have certain imprints that aren't so great that we've practiced before, and so we have to work with that. But there certainly is, a correlation that we will find it easy or not to do things, easier or less easy to do things based on past practice.
Thank you.
Okay, so verse 4 here is following on, and it says, so when it says finding firm and definite conviction in this, it's talking about verse 3, where it says that after death, the results of black and white karma follow, meaning that the karmas that we've accumulated will bring results, either beneficial, supportive, useful, constructive results, or more painful, suffering, disadvantageous results. And when we can develop really firm conviction in this teaching of the Buddha based on our understanding of the Buddha as a non-deceptive teacher who is giving us a framework that's only meant to be of benefit to us for our lives and our spiritual growth and development, then what follows from that is a genuine interest, a genuine motivation to, as it says here, abandon even the slightest negativities and accomplish all virtuous deeds. So to really live one's life acknowledging and in accordance with this law of karma that the Buddha is observing and discussing. He's just letting us know, this is, hey, this is the way the mind works. Just like other great scientists, the Buddha studied the mind, and other great philosophers and so on. Of course, there are different, of course, the Buddha had an ability to observe that is unique as compared to a scientist or a philosopher who isn't fully enlightened. But, but there's some analogy in the sense that other great thinkers and philosophers, they also said, hey, I'm just telling you, this is how electromagnetism works. This is how gravity works. This is, and these are just laws of the universe. And the Buddha wasn't interested in those kinds of laws. He was interested in the laws that govern the mind, that govern spiritual development. And those are the laws that he explained. And so when a person has a real conviction in that, then they live in accordance with that. Just like, if you want to travel outside the Earth's, environment, and you want to travel to the moon or visit other planets, you don't have the option of changing the law of gravity. You don't have the option of changing how certain materials are going to interact with the atmosphere when when they're moving through that at escape velocity. So you have to understand, okay, well, what is escape velocity? What kinds of materials will allow me to be shielded from the temperatures that inevitably, inescapably will be developed by approaching and exceeding escape velocity and so on. So then you have to do all of these tests, and you have to create these systems and these processes, because the laws themselves are immutable. The laws themselves, just are what they are. And so Buddhists work cooperatively with the law of karma to get the result that they are seeking, just like astronauts have to work cooperatively with the laws of nature to get what they want, and chemists and botanists, and they're all just having to work cooperatively with the laws of nature to accomplish what they're interested in, what their particular goals are. So enlightenment is simply something that the universe permits. The universe also permits us to not accomplish enlightenment, to remain ordinary sentient beings experiencing rebirth and so on. That universe permits both options, just like the universe permits our species to reach the stars or decide not to. We can just stay earthbound. We don't have to explore and so on. And the scientists would say, well, there's good reasons, for exploring. And the Buddha would say the same. He would say there are good reasons to try to achieve enlightenment. It's better than not trying to achieve enlightenment. But, we're permitted to choose either way. But if we do want to do it, then all we can really do is understand deeply what the laws are that govern all of these things, and then figure out how to work within that system to get the result that we're looking for. And that's why the Buddha taught the system of karma, is because if we don't work cooperatively with the law of karma, then we're making it almost impossible to achieve that result. If we ignore the law of karma, then the Buddha's observation is almost impossible to get the result of enlightenment. And so he gave us this wisdom so that we could achieve much, much, much more easily that particular result.
Venerable Dondrub,
Yes.
when in that fourth verse, where it says, please bless me, who are we asking to bless me?
So, I mean, in general, we're referencing the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. A person could, um, a lot of times, they will, in a lot of prayers that are like that, the phrase, Guru Buddha will be used, or Guru deity will be used. So if a person has an understanding, has a relationship with a teacher, like we talked about in the first verse, if they have a guru, then they would be visualizing their guru, and understanding that their guru is a manifestation of the mind, of all of the Buddhas, what's called the Dharmakaya, the mind of that is the same mind of all of the Buddhas. So there's different ways of that a person could think about it, depending on, and if they're a tantric practitioner, they might be thinking about it in a slightly different way, than if they're just a sutra practitioner. And so in a way, it kind of depends on what relationships a practitioner has with certain aspects of the path. But essentially, enlightened mind or enlightened activity is what we are drawing a relationship, drawing close to. The form that takes can vary depending on the level of the practitioner.
Venerable, yes, thank you. How would a tantric practitioner view that versus a sutra practitioner?
Um, I mean, I guess I would say it's kind of up to that practitioner in a way. They would, um, because there's a way of Vajradhara is kind of the primordial tantric embodiment, the embodiment of the tantric teachings. So it could be for them, possibly, it isn't like there's a right and a wrong way necessarily, but when they're relating to Guru Buddha or Guru deity, they could be seeing potentially, perhaps, their guru as one with Vajradhara, rather than one with Shakyamuni Buddha. Perhaps it would be a possibility, or it could be the deity that they're particularly practicing, could be involved in that process.
Thank you.
Okay, so now, as I said, we're going to go into a section where we talk about karma in detail. And the first part of that is to look at what are called the four factors of a complete karma. So karma has two types, complete and incomplete. And it depends upon whether all four of these factors are present. If all four of these factors are present, then you have a complete karma. If one or more are absent, you have an incomplete karma. And these two types of karma, complete karmas are more powerful than incomplete karmas. A complete karma can, at the time of death, the kind of karma that ripens at the time of death that establishes what kind of realm that mind is going to take rebirth in, necessarily is a complete karma, because it's more powerful. So if it's an incomplete karma, it lacks the ability, that just doesn't have the power at the time of death to throw a person into their next incarnation. So complete karmas are also can be called throwing karmas, because they are the kind of karma that establishes the realm of a rebirth. An incomplete karma is something that still exists. It's has its own power, but it fills in the details. It ripens within a lifetime and fills in the details. Okay. Okay. So this is, I don't know. I never know if you need to go full screen to see that clearly or not. These words are a bit smaller. Um, but maybe if you open it full screen, you can see clearly. Um, so this is sort of describing these the four parts, and it goes from sort of the top to the bottom is the way that it flows. So first you have what's called the basis, and the basis is the sentient being. Generally, because when we create karma, it's generally in relation to some other sentient being. And so, uh, even if that sentient being is oneself in some circumstances, but so you observe or you identify the sentient being that you are relating to, that you're going to engage in an action toward. And then, after having identified that sentient being, you create some intention to relate to that sentient being in a particular way. So, if we were to use an example, we could use the example of like a spider in your kitchen. So, you go into the kitchen and you observe that there is a spider on your kitchen counter. And so you then decide how you're going to be in relation to this spider. And you kind of maybe have three options. Option one is maybe you're concerned about the spider, maybe not being in a natural environment, maybe not having, food or water. And so you think, okay, well, maybe I'll take it outside and put it in a tree or something where maybe it'll live longer. And that, so you're concerned about it. You want to extend its life, and so you engage. And so then you get a cup, and so that would be the act. So you observe the sentient being. You think about how you're motivated to be in relationship to it, and then you go about executing that intention. So you would go get a cup, and you would put the cup over the spider, and it would crawl into the bottom of the cup, and you would take it outside and shake it very gently into a bush or something. You could be kind of indifferent to the spider and just be like, well, it's not really bothering me. I'm just not going to bother it. Or maybe you're a little bit, averse to it, a little bit grossed out, and you're just like, well, I'm going to leave it alone and just let it do its thing. Or that aversion could be quite strong, and you might think, well, I'm going to end the life of this spider. I don't like spiders. It's in my house. I don't want it in my house. And so I'm going to end its life. So you would then get, a shoe or a paper towel or something, and you would squash it. That would be the act. So the act would be either helping it to live longer, or the act would just be like, going about your business, ignoring it, or the act would be intentionally engaging in some effort to bring about its death. And then you have the completion of the act. So that would be, you go outside and you shake it out, and you observe that it is in fact no longer in the cup. It's now kind of happily chilling out on the bush, and then you just go back inside. Or you just kind of leave the room, and you put it out of your mind, and you've closed that chapter on that interaction by picking up some new activity, cooking or reading or watching a movie or something, and you've decided that you're not going to be, in relation anymore. Or again, you had the wish to harm it, and you observe that you have in fact killed it. You look at it, the squashed bug, on the paper towel or whatever. So you have the basis, the intention, the act, and the completion. So if any one of those four or more than one of those four are not present, then you have an incomplete karmic act, or an incomplete karma. So for example, if you wanted to kill the spider and the spider just scurried underneath the counter, the cabinets or something, then you looked at it and you said, "Oh, I want to kill this spider." You went and got something, and you had a full sort of physical action where you fully committed and smashed, but the spider scurried out of the way. So you didn't succeed. The spider's still alive, and then let's say you just give up. Like you're like, "Okay, I don't know where it is. It's not bothering me anymore, so I'm not motivated enough to sort of hunt for it." And so that's an incomplete karma of killing, because you really tried, but you didn't succeed. So it's not good because you really made a strong effort, but we can't say that it's a complete karmic action of killing, because you were prevented. Had it not gotten out of the way through its own effort, you would have succeeded. So it's not like, but also it's also true, perhaps, that you could stop yourself. You might, get the paper towel, and you might be about to, but then you're like, well, no, I shouldn't do this. The spider's life is, really important to the spider, and all life is deserving of being supported, and so I'm going to just, maybe then I really will take it outside. So then you kind of have sort of a mixed bag. Like for a while there, your mind was going in a negative direction, and you were kind of practicing a not so great way of thinking and being in relation, but you interrupted that process, and then you ended up engaging in a really virtuous, positive action. So kind of both happened, but in that situation, the stronger, the virtuous karma was stronger, and so that it ended up being, good. It would have been even better, though, if you never had the thought to harm the spider. Like if that never even occurred to you, and your only thought was to be of benefit to the spider, of course, that would have been a better 5 minutes of your life than the other one. But I would say, of course, the fact that you interrupted that pattern is, as we've said, going to make it more likely that next time you won't, it's going to get easier to be supportive of that insect life, or the lives of things that you're not so thrilled to be around. So even though, we can say that, it's not great, you've created a better way of doing things, or a better way of thinking about things, and so you're setting yourself up to go in the right direction, which is great. Much better than not doing that. Um, so you kind of have like an incomplete karma of killing, and then a complete karma of benefiting, because you actually succeeded in benefiting. You observed the same sentient being, but you had a different intention, a different act, and you actually completed that act, the act of benefiting. So that's good, comparatively. So this is true. This applies then for any karmic act, whether it's virtuous or non-virtuous. You have these four factors: the basis, the intention, the act, and the completion. And if any one of these is absent, or more than one, then that will weaken that karma, in relation to that. And there's other factors too that strengthen or weaken karma, but this is just in relation to complete or incomplete. Any questions about the four factors of a completed karmic action? Okay. So now we'll go into what are called the 10 non-virtuous actions. And so these are, this isn't, everything that the Buddha says about karma, or ethics for that matter, but it's sort of the foundation of the Buddha's ethical teachings, the ethical guidelines. So these are 10 major categories of actions, or karmas, where, again, as I mentioned, the Buddha, his observation was really difficult for most ordinary sentient beings to do these 10 things while maintaining a motivation or an intention that is helpful to others. Very difficult to do these in a beneficial, supportive, uplifting, sort of pro-social way. Generally, for most ordinary people, when they do these things, it's for a very selfish, self-serving purpose, where they're putting their interests above the interests of other sentient beings. And again, there's that correlation between those two flavors of energy and the effects that they bring when they ripen in the future. So we'll start with ethical guidelines for the body. This is going to be broken up into the body, the speech, and the mind, what are called the three doors through which we create karmic actions. We either create karmic actions using our physical body, or we do them using our speech, or even we can do them sometimes purely mentally, without doing anything with our body or our speech. Okay, so here this is framed. So these are the opposite of, so the way these are framed are sort of positive guidelines, like things to avoid. The actions themselves are the 10 non-virtuous actions, but it's being framed here as avoid these, do not do these 10 things. When you do any one of these 10 things, they are the 10 non-virtues. Okay, so the three that we do with our body is to kill, to steal, or to commit sexual misconduct. And the Buddha is saying, avoid killing, avoid stealing, avoid sexual misconduct. So we'll look at each of these in turn. Once I guess, the way that this is, we're just going to do an overview of the 10, and then we'll circle back and look at each in more detail. So the way that we can relate to others with our speech that's negative would be to lie or to engage in divisive speech, harsh speech, or idle speech. I can't remember. Sorry. So, no, I guess I don't have. Sorry, let me I haven't used these slides in a while. So let me just look and see if I am missing actual slides that go into more detail or not. Okay, I don't think I do. Okay. I think I did it one time, but I don't anymore. So that's fine. We don't need that. Okay. So I will then go back to ethical guidelines for the body. So we'll look at each of these in turn. The first is do not kill. So to kill is to intentionally take the life of a sentient being. And in Tibetan, sentient being, what we translate into English as sentient being in Tibetan is sem chen, or mind possessor. So a sentient being is a mind possessor. And from the Buddhist perspective, you can go all the way down to like flies or mosquitoes or worms, things like that, really, really small creatures, and those are all mind possessors from the Buddhist perspective. Plants are not mind possessors from the Buddhist perspective. Trees, any kind of grass, what have you. Now, of course, sentient beings live in trees and in the grass, and so there's of course a relationship, or could be a relationship, between killing plant life and animal life. But plant life itself is not a sentient being. Plants have amazing qualities, and there's certainly some degree, even of, you could maybe even say, a rudimentary intelligence, a way of taking information in from the environment and responding to it, and even transmitting chemically information and so on. But the critical difference from the Buddhist perspective is this idea of mind possessor, which means that that form either can or cannot host consciousness. And plants are not considered to be capable of hosting consciousness. So it's impossible to die and take rebirth as a plant. But it's not impossible to die and take rebirth, for the mind to associate with the form of a mosquito or a cockroach or a worm. Those are all mind possessors. And His Holiness says that we can distinguish between the two using the test of volitional movement. So if you observe the living thing, so of course plants are living things, they're just not mind possessors. If you observe the living thing for a time, a day, a week, and it may move over the course of a day, a week, but does it move only in relation to changes in the environment, like the presence or the absence of the sun, or the presence or absence of some change in the environment? Or does it sometimes seem to move from here to there just because, intentionally or volitionally, meaning that it just kind of seems like it felt like it, just wanted to? If that's true, if you can say that there was movement with no change in the environment, no addition or subtraction of an environmental stimulus, that's volitional movement. And if a living thing has volitional movement, it's a sentient being. That's a test that His Holiness says that we can use. So certainly flies and mosquitoes and things, sometimes, yes, they do fly to where there's food, but sometimes they just move. Sometimes they just get up and there's nothing was different about the environment. So the vow, or so this statement applies to even flies and mosquitoes and things. We are exhorted by the Buddha to avoid intentionally taking the life of any sentient being. Yeah. But when we looked, so this overlaps when we looked at the lay vows previously, what we'll see is that some of these non-virtues overlap with the lay vows. And some don't. But this is one that does. So not only is it naturally negative, which is why it's here in the non-virtues, meaning that it's non-virtuous for any person at any time, is the Buddha's observation, but it's also a vow that a Buddhist takes when they go for refuge. They're vowing not to kill a human or an animal, or even, again, down to a mosquito. To steal is, again, the same in terms of it overlaps. And we covered that before when we looked at the lay vows. To steal, again, is to take anything that is not freely given and to appropriate it for one's own use. And then sexual misconduct is also part of the lay vows, and it refers to either adultery or any kind of non-consensual behavior, any non-consensual sexual behavior. So it might be consensual, but if you're monogamous, then it's sexual misconduct. So it can be either adultery or non-consensual. Okay, so are there any questions about the first of these three? So here, the 10 non-virtues, some overlap with the lay vows and some don't, because the Buddha's observation is that all of these are naturally negative. And the reason that there are additional ones that we'll talk about is because the lay vows are meant to be kind of coarser actions, less subtle actions that it's reasonable for a person to say, I'll never do again. Subtler actions, it's probably not reasonable to say, I'll never do again for the rest of my life. So there are things that are naturally negative, but that it wasn't suitable to create like an actual vow with regard to. But any thoughts or questions about the body, ethical guidelines for the body? Okay. So now we have ethical guidelines for our speech. And this is where we'll see some divergence between the vows and things that are negative. So, of course, not lying is not divergence, that is also a vow. To lie is to say anything that we know to be untrue to a person who can understand what we're saying and could be subsequently deceived by what we're saying. But then these other three are more subtle. So the Buddha didn't create lay vows with respect to divisive speech, harsh speech, or idle speech. But still, the Buddha's observation is that they're not great, that we should try to make a genuine effort to avoid divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle speech, even though it's much more difficult, and we'll probably be doing it from time to time. So divisive speech is anything that is intended to cause disunity, disharmony between two or more other people, to set people apart from each other. So it doesn't have to be a lie. You could be telling the truth, but if your goal is to separate people, to cause disharmony, disunity, then you're dividing people, and you're, it's not, your motivation is to do that. Your motivation is to cause disharmony or disunity. Harsh speech is anything that we might communicate where the goal is to wound with our communication, mentally, emotionally. So when we raise our voice in anger, when we say insulting things, the goal is to cause some sort of harm or wound with our words, to make the other person feel bad in some way, to to insult, to demean the other person. And then idle speech can be understood in a technical way that's really impossible to uphold. Technically, we can think of it as if we're talking about anything other than the teachings, anything other than spirituality, we're engaging in idle speech in a technical way. But that's impossible. We can't really hold it in that way. Monks and nuns in monasteries and nunneries, even they probably can't hold it, quite like that. Maybe more so than we can, but really idle speech is kind of gossiping, kind of, Venerable Urbina says, rabbiting on about nothing. Just when we're kind of wasting our time, we're wasting the other person's time. And it's particularly bad when we're talking about people behind their backs. Like, that's probably the worst form of idle speech, is like, oh, did you hear what so and so said? Or they did this silly, this dumb thing. And how, so talking badly about people behind their backs. But even really, if we're just going on and on about popular culture, or just sort of meaningless nonsense talk, and this is something, of course, we're going to do in every day, really, to some degree, but just to be mindful about how much we're doing it, and are we doing it in ways where subtly or overtly we're trying to put other people down, or we're trying to feel better about ourselves. That's particularly harmful. But the main thing is to just kind of think, how much of my life do I spend doing this in general, kind of just being meaningless and wasting people's time with my speech. What they say is that it's, in one way of talking, it's the least negative, like in any given individual act of idle speech, it's the lightest of the non-virtues of speech. However, they also say it's the easiest one to spend your life kind of immersed in. Because lying and divisive speech and harsh speech, generally we don't do so much of. But this idle speech, this gossiping, we might do that a lot. So in that way, it's kind of quite negative. Okay, any thoughts about the non-virtues of the speech?
That's interesting about being meaningless. When you think about that, really is kind of hard to define, but I think it's something that goes very deep.
Yeah, I should kind of like, why, like, what's my purpose? Like, why am I deciding to say this to this person? Am I sharing, a genuine interest that that person has? Am I creating a closer bond with that person? Or am I just kind of filling the air, just kind of like, I don't really have anything to say. And so I'm just going to kind of talk about this TV show that I just watched, that maybe they don't really care about. And I'm not even sure I really care about it, but it's just like, oh, it's something to talk about. It's just something to, or, football, or, now if it's really drawing you closer to that person and you have a really shared, love for something, and you're creating a really caring bond over a shared interest, that's a different thing. But am I just is it just sort of pointless? Is there no real intentionality behind why I've decided to say this to this person? Okay, so now it's also possible one of the three doors is just the mind. So we don't have to say something out loud or do a physical action. We can create karma simply by having thoughts, um, which is quite subtle, and also, so none of these are vows, um, because they're all quite subtle. So, covetousness, ill will, and wrong views are the three non virtues that occur mentally. These can all lead to, of course, they can lead to actions of body and speech, and oftentimes they may. Under the influence of covetousness, ill will, or wrong views, we may engage in verbal actions or physical actions, but it could also just remain as a mental karma as well. And if it's joined with a physical action, then still the mental action has its own kind of power, its own karmic power. So covetousness is to observe something that isn't ours, something owned by someone else, and to think, oh, I wish I, could have that thing. And then to kind of think about, um, I wonder if there's something, is there some way that I could get that? Um, so it's kind of, we might not actually do that, but we're kind of like wanting or hoping that that other person gives it to us, or we could get that. It's to sort of have designs in our mind on the possessions of other people, that the possessions that other people have. um, and I mean, it could be another. So, and it is necessarily of inanimate possession. It could be a job that they have or a relationship that they have. Like you could, coveting thy neighbor's wife, would fall under this sort of thing. So, it doesn't mean that they possess something inanimate. They may possess a status or, um, you know, a title or something, and you want that for yourself, and you're like, oh, I wonder if there's some way that I could undermine or get that or cause that to become something that now I have. um, Even if you never actually go about trying to do it, you just kind of, you're kind of the mind's kind of moving in that direction. Ill will is to wish harm upon some other person or animal, or so again, you may not actually do anything that causes harm to that person, that animal, what have you, that sentient being, but you would be okay with it. You kind of want it to happen. You are thinking about it. You're imagining or visualizing or hoping that they are harmed in some way. Um, yeah. And then wrong views is sort of a uniquely sort of Buddhist idea. Um, it because it refers to holding in mind an idea, a philosophy that is counter to the teachings. So that where, for example, like if you were to say that, karma is something that the Buddha just made up, or the idea of enlightenment is something that just the Buddha just fabricated, just he was, he just wanted to get power, he just wanted to get followers, and and of course there are many people who feel this way, who think, who think in that way. So it's not a moralistic thing, but it's just to say that if a person really feels that way, if they're convinced in their own mind that some teaching of the Buddha is absolutely wrongheaded, absolutely doesn't in any way correlate with what's true, then that's really going to block them from following the Buddhist path. Um, and if they don't want to follow the Buddhist path, then okay, then that's fine. Then they follow the, whatever path. But this is just coming from a Buddhist perspective. Um, Susan, did you have a question or?
Yes, does wrong views include views on emptiness, wrong views on emptiness?
Yeah, it would, if a person, so yeah, I mean, if a person had the view of like a soul from, again, from a different religious perspective, if they said, oh, it isn't true that, that the mind is empty, that there is a findable, and they call that the soul, and they would say that the soul is unchanging and permanent, and in a way that is at odds with how it's talked about in Buddhism, because of course Buddhism does accept, that there is a very subtle mind that carries karmic seeds and, takes rebirth and so on. So that's sort of a version of a soul, but it's dynamic, it's changeable, it's not permanent. Um, and so it could even be the idea of like permanent heaven, permanent hell, those sorts of ideas. They're not bad, but they make it impossible to follow the Buddhist teachings. They would take a person away from being able to follow the Buddhist teachings, because that person would be following a system that leads to, from in their mind, leads to permanent heaven. And that would be their goal. And that disagrees with how the Buddha understands reality to exist. So it isn't a moralistic kind of a thing. It's not saying that that's wrong or that's bad. It's just in the framework of enlightenment, um, if you don't think that enlightenment is a thing, you won't accomplish it.
Thank you, Venerable.
Okay, any thoughts or questions? Okay. Okay. So I don't have, there's a next couple things I don't have slides on, but that's all right. Not sure to figure out what happened. I had slides. So we will see what to do here. Just switch to 1 second. Focus. Okay. So we'll look at one more verse tonight, which is verse 5. And again, I don't have a slide prepared, so I don't have it on the screen, but I'll read it. Verse 5 is, seeking samsaric pleasures is the door to all suffering. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, please bless me to generate the mind, the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. Seeking samsaric pleasures is the door to all suffering. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, please bless me to generate the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. So with this, we've now moved from the small scope to the middle scope. So karma is the last contemplation on the small scope. So what a person uses to, because again, we've said that the goal of the small scope is to transform the mind from a mind that is preoccupied with just the content of this one life alone into a mind that cares more about our overall spiritual trajectory, where we are headed, where things are going spiritually in future lives. Understanding that there are many, there's an infinite number of future lives. And so that's sort of just generally more important than the next 30, 50, 70 years pales in comparison to all future lives. But that's a huge reorientation, for it's certainly not nothing. It's a massive reorientation to care more about that. Of course, logically, if you really accept all of these, you develop, again, this strong conviction in what the Buddha is saying, then logically, of course, you can see how that makes sense. But for us, to actually make that shift is extraordinary. A person who genuinely accomplishes the small scope isn't amazing compared to, an ordinary person, is amazing. So it's really a feat to genuinely accomplish the small scope. But what a person needs to be able to do that is those contemplations, the contemplation on properly relating to the spiritual guide, understanding the qualities and the preciousness and the rarity of a perfect human rebirth, and then understanding death and impermanence, and then understanding karma and its effects. With all of those realizations, you have all of the tools that you need because rebirth is a karmically driven process. So if you live cooperatively with karma, you will accomplish good future rebirths. And you can put an end to the worst kinds of rebirths. But you're not putting an end to rebirth as a whole. You're still participating in the cycle of rebirth. You're just trying to focus those experiences on a relatively narrow range of rebirth, of what's possible within all of the options for rebirth. You're focusing in on a subset of that, and you're excluding the worst kinds of experiences. However, if you mature your perspective and you recognize that good future rebirths have utility, but they're not an end in themselves, you then would want to practice the middle scope, where you realize that what we call good future rebirths are still disadvantageous in comparison to either lower nirvana or full enlightenment, depending on how much further you're going to go on the path. They're at least disadvantageous as compared to lower nirvana, and they're disadvantageous for a Mahayana practitioner as compared to full enlightenment as well. Because we right now, as we know, as we talked about on the small scope, we have a good rebirth. A human rebirth is an upper realm rebirth. But we know there's all kinds of sufferings in the human realm. There's extraordinary painful conditions that arise, diseases and wars and famines and tortures. All kinds of really, really miserable experiences that can occur in the human realm, which is considered an upper realm good future rebirth. And then, of course, you would probably consider too that if you're talking about really eons of time, you're talking about extremely long time scales, the probability of only having those rebirths, statistically, it starts to get less likely. You can certainly set yourself up for a period of time of good future rebirths. But to say that you're going to keep that up for eons and eons and eons with all of the environmental factors that can influence, a person's, that starts to get tricky. So on the middle scope, we recognize that we do and we need to create a succession of good future rebirths. But we recognize that when you compare that to what's possible, which is either lower nirvana or full enlightenment, then lower nirvana or full enlightenment start to look really good in comparison to the sufferings that inevitably occur even in good future rebirths. So that becomes now where you're headed. That becomes your goal, is either one of those two. Again, from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, full enlightenment; from the Theravada perspective, lower nirvana. But that becomes what you're motivated to do, the real purpose of what you're motivated to do, due to an understanding that if you remain as an ordinary sentient being, good future rebirths are not that great. They're comparatively beneficial, but they have drawbacks. And that's what's being talked about here in verse 5. Seeking samsaric pleasures is the door, to all suffering. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. So samsaric pleasures mean just remaining as an ordinary sentient being and trying to maximize, good food, pleasurable, comfortable circumstances, having, enough resources, being thought of well by others, all of these sorts of comparatively pleasant states of existence, because certainly having shelter, having food, being thought of well, those are more pleasant than being homeless, starving, being reviled. Comparatively, of course, we can see that one's better than the other, but they're changeable. You can pursue having a good reputation, you can pursue having high status, having wealth, being comfortable, having good food. That can be your personal goal, but you're going to die. That you can pursue that for some time, but that life will end. And what have you done other than try to pursue those things for a short period of time? And also, they you can't really be certain that they're going to last. You might spend a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort into pursuing wealth, and then it could all get wiped out in a stock market crash, or a war could come along, and a relatively safe, high status, position that you had could be, now you're on the streets, now you're, fighting for your life, etc. So they're very fickle states, even within a given lifetime. There's no guarantee that all of your effort will really be rewarded. From the Buddhist perspective, this is because they are also karmically driven processes. And so we think that if we, just try hard in school, and we, move to the right country, or we make the right choices in our career, then that will protect us from suffering. That will give us these things. But the Buddha's observation is that, well, no, really, these are karmically driven processes. So by thinking about them in the wrong way, we're kind of pursuing the wrong causes. If we want wealth, the Buddha would say we need to be generous. If we want stable, loving relationships, the Buddha would say we need to avoid sexual misconduct. If we want people to believe our words, we need to avoid lying. Karmically, and so we may find ourselves in a situation where people often don't take us seriously, or they don't, even though we're not lying in this life, we've lied in previous lives, and that energy is ripening in ways that are causing conflict, causing, people to relate to us in a way that we're not enjoying, that's difficult for us, that's painful for us, because it's a karmically driven process. And we may not be able to prevent the arising of a karma from a previous life, at the moment. So the idea is that we fundamentally misunderstand how to go about creating the causes and conditions for genuine, real happiness, because we think that just amassing wealth and property and, managing our reputation, all of these things, is what brings genuine, lasting, true, permanent happiness. And the Buddha's like, oh no, it doesn't. That's just not true. That's not accurate. So, and that's why if we make that the foundation of our effort, of our lives, it's the door to all suffering. It's because we will then die never having really created the karmic causes of genuine happiness, because all we did was try to kind of rearrange external conditions. So when we think about that deeply, then we generate, as it says, the strong wish for the bliss of liberation. We give up on trying to rearrange these externals. We give up on trying to make samsara work in a permanent, lasting way. We think, well, it isn't possible. Samsara can't. Samsara is kind of fundamentally broken. It has utility in that I might be able to, well, certainly I can, through effort, through understanding the law of karma, etc. I can give myself the time and the conditions that I need for spiritual growth and development, but that has to ripen in liberation, either, as we've said, individual liberation or full enlightenment. Those are both genuine cessations. They're both paths taught by the Buddha. They're both a form of liberation from cyclic existence. It's just that from the Mahayana perspective, it is full enlightenment that is recommended, that is presented as the highest goal. But they're both paths taught by the Buddha. And so when we really deeply understand the shortcomings of samsara, then that becomes our North Star, is liberation, is giving up on trying to make samsara work. And Venerable Lesog, just that was the Discovering Buddhism module. If you're interested in more information on this topic as a whole, that is the topic that Venerable Lesog just did, and it's on our YouTube channel, Samsara and Nirvana, Module 9 of Discovering Buddhism, is kind of on this topic. And so there's a lot of additional information there. It's all on the YouTube channel. So that's a lot of information. Any thoughts or questions on verse 5?
Venerable, is Hinayana and Theravada the same? Are they the same?
Technically, my understanding is that there used to be, at the time, shortly after the time of the Buddha, people are very good, humans are very good at coming up with different systems of thought. And at one time, there were 18 different philosophical schools of thought that kind of had their own take on interpreting the Buddha's teachings. The Theravada school is the only surviving school of thought in present day that espouses individual liberation as the goal of Buddhist practice. So there used to be more. There used to be additional philosophical schools. All of those philosophical schools could fall under the umbrella of Hinayana, of the individual. Well, I mean, technically, it's the way that you would translate that into English is lesser vehicle, greater vehicle or lesser vehicle, Mahayana or Hinayana. His Holiness prefers individual vehicle because lesser can sound pejorative to practitioners of Theravada. So technically, so on a practical level, I mean, yes, they're interchangeable, but technically they're not, because there used to be more philosophical schools that espoused Hinayana principles or tenet systems, but now there's just the one, which is Theravada.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we are just slightly out of time, and so we'll leave it there for today. And we just have the one class left next week, where we'll cover the rest of the middle scope and the great scope. All right, any concluding thoughts or questions?
No, just thank you for the teaching tonight.
Sure. Thanks for coming.
Mhm.
All right, so we'll pick it back up next week.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Have a good night. Have a good weekend. Take care.